Hello and welcome to Axumawian Media. My name is Melat Habtu and I'll be hosting Inside Tigray, a show that will give you a Tigrayan perspective on global, continental and statewide affairs. Please tune in, listen, engage and participate for an insightful and constructive discussion. So thank you, Mukesh, for coming to today's episode. Today's episode, as you can see, we've got Mukesh Kapila with us, and a lot of us know him. He has done amazing work in a lot of the humanitarian work and also the recognition of many genocides and advocacy in terms of speaking on genocides that sometimes get discarded and sometimes may not come to light, sometimes may be ignored. Mukesh has done a great job throughout his career in bringing a lot of genocides and a lot of atrocities against crimes against humanity to light. Mukesh currently is a professor at University of Manchester, if I'm not mistaken, and he is a professor of health and humanitarian affairs. And he was also previously head of the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, and Mukesh, thank you so much for being with us here today. Maybe I'll give you a couple of minutes to introduce yourself better than I did, and just tell us a bit about the work you've done previously and the work that you may be doing in the future or are presently doing.
Thank you, and I'm grateful for this opportunity to be here in this discussion. What can I say about myself? I mean, as a public health physician and as a specialist in conflict and peace over many decades, unfortunately, my life has taken me to all sorts of terrible places where atrocities and genocides have been done, like in Darfur, like in Rwanda, like in Srebrenica, in Cambodia, and so on. So really, that has accompanied me in the last few years of my life, and I'm therefore sorry when the war in Tigray started, and it had so many of the genocidal aspects that I've seen in so many other situations. So that's how I find myself here.
Yeah, I mean, it is an unfortunate thing to have to be doing, but it is also a much needed service, Mukesh. So I would highlight that. So just starting on some of the topics that we'll be touching base on today, you recently wrote an opinion piece, which was very, very, I think, very insightful about the war in Tigray and the current peace deal and currently the conditions of the relationship between the Ethiopian government and the TPLF, and also just generally how you expect that peace should be obtained, and what you feel like are the cement blocks to making sure that the peace is implemented and is sustainable. So maybe just give us a couple of minutes of a brief summary about what you mentioned in that article for the listeners, so that when we go into the train of thought about asking the questions, the listener can have an idea about what you actually wrote in the opinion piece.
Well, the core of my contention, and this is based on many decades of experience of other situations, is that you cannot have sustainable peace without justice and accountability accompanying it. And the question then for Ethiopia is whether the current peace process has sufficient accountability and justice built into it to give it a chance for succeeding in the long run. Just because the guns are silenced doesn't mean there is peace. And the other fact to remember in the unfortunate history of Ethiopia is that this is a country that has been in internal conflict for decades and decades and decades. And this last chapter, which we have been, has to be seen in that bigger context. So unless we find political solutions, which everyone in principle wants, then I think there's a chance that this thing will happen again. And therefore, this is an overriding and most critical point in history for Ethiopia, including Tigray and the other areas, is whether or not the corner can be finally turned.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a good summary. So from some of the things that stood out to me from what you mentioned in the article was this the sentiment of ambiguity. The fact that the peace deal is rooted, not very detailed on a lot of the expectations that a lot of people had for it to be detailed in, that leaving that air of uncertainty and maybe that room for negotiation. You mentioned that could actually be positive because it leads to further dialogue, right? And when I was starting to read about that and process what you meant by that, I started to think maybe ambiguity can also be a negative thing, and that being because it lacks the ability for outside external kind of reinforcers of this peace agreement to actually hold the parties to account. For there to be an actual checklist of what these parties need to implement for the peace deal to actually be sustainable. And whether it's very hard to tell whether either one of the parties are holding their end of the deal. If we have something that's a deal that's very ambiguous. For example, the things such as like the humanitarian aid and the level of humanitarian aid that's expected to enter the region, for example. There's no specific numbers or there's no specific date stated. And the Ethiopian government many times, when questioned by international reporters, has pushed back on giving like certain dates and milestones. And that in turn will mean that there is no international kind of condemnation when it comes to the lack of the level of humanitarian aid entering the region, or things like the return of the IDPs, for example. How can we really track the success of the implementation of the deal if we leave it to be ambiguous?
Well, I think it depends on the reason for the ambiguity. For example, if the ambiguity is simply we don't know, after all, peace making is a journey, not a destination, as I say in my little opinion piece. And with all the fog of war that has recently taken place in the last 2 years, I mean, there are genuine uncertainties. We don't actually know how much aid is enough. And we don't know, for example, how it's going to get through because so much of the infrastructure has been destroyed and resources are limited and so on and so forth. So if that ambiguity is based out of not knowing the realities, then that's a reasonable ambiguity. If, on the other hand, the ambiguity is based on lack of good faith, then of course I agree with you that it could be extremely dangerous. And sooner or later, you'll get found out and the peace process will break down. But this is where we have the monitoring mechanism that is supposed to be there, masterminded by the African Union, in terms of being able to track what is going on and able to track both the amount of war and peace there is, the amount of access there is, and how many people are being helped. And I think that verification is the way that trust and confidence is going to be built. My other point in the same context is let not impatience destroy the process. I mean, it's my worry is that people think, right, a piece of paper has been signed, and now tomorrow everything is going to be all right. Well, peace grows in the hearts of people. It doesn't grow from a piece of paper, especially when a piece of paper has been signed by the elites from both sides. And I'm not sure how much consultation took place with people concerned. And many key stakeholders are not even mentioned, like the Eritreans or other groups in Ethiopia. So I think in that context, we can give it the benefit of the doubt, but it needs to be very closely monitored, not just by the African Union, which is not an independent body. Unfortunately, they're quite state-centered, and therefore they're on the side of the Ethiopian government more than on the Tigrayan side. That is the nature of bodies like the African Union, or for that matter, the United Nations, because these are state-based organizations. But this is why we need independent journalism, independent monitors, independent civil society to give us a kind of more wider perspective on what exactly is going on the ground. Now, whether that will happen or not, I don't know. So far, I don't see much progress of easy access by everyone who wants to go there and report on what's going on. And I hope that can shift in the future if we are to have confidence in this process going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that actually a very good point, because it leads me on to what I wanted to actually speak about. The International Commission of Human Rights Experts on Ethiopia and their investigation. So within, you mentioned that you believe for this peace process, a hybrid international model of justice-seeking mechanisms would be ideal. And you mentioned that obviously peace deal is closed off in the fact that it's very internal, Ethiopian-centered, state-centered justice mechanisms. And the transitional justice aspect of it is very much internal. And as you mentioned, we are yet to see the readiness of the Ethiopian government to allow these civil societies or to allow non-partial actors into Tigray to actually to be able to write reports and to give data about what they believe is actually going on in terms of justice and accountability. But so the lack of readiness, even, I mean, we've seen it in the fact that the Ethiopian state tried to stop the mandate of the commission being extended. It pushed back many times against this investigation. Is it ready for an international mechanism of justice to be implemented in the Tigray region? Is it ready for that? And does it not want that because it's still trying to deflect from accountability? And if so, how sustainable is this domestic internal kind of process of justice, the justice system being used for the justice and accountability mechanism?
I think we don't have much detail on the proposed transitional justice mechanism, either from the Ethiopian state authorities or from the African Union. But we can say something from what's been said and not said. And that is that there are no statements that imply a commitment to fair justice and fair accountability. Not even rhetoric to that effect. At least not even the right words are being said, which we might have some confidence in. So I think in that regard, and bearing in mind what has gone on in the last 2 years, where the agents and institutions of the Ethiopian state have perpetrated such horrendous crimes against humanity in the conduct of this war, I'm extremely pessimistic that a fair and inclusive mechanism that people can have confidence in will happen. Now, I would love to be proved wrong, but so far the signals are not good. So, if such a credible mechanism is not put into place that people have faith in, then I'm afraid the inevitable is going to happen. The conflict will resume. Whether it resumes sooner rather than later, I can't say, and we all hope it will be later rather than sooner, because every day that there isn't active war is a good day for humanity. But I think it's inevitable that the violence will resume at some time or the other. Or if peace is imposed in a forced way, it'll break up without a political solutions being found. And I can't see political solutions being found for the many problems, constitutional and otherwise, of Ethiopia without taking accountability and justice into account. So this is a kind of circular place we are in, where it's difficult to move forward without the Ethiopian state allowing that free accountability and justice to take place. And because the state itself has been a party in the conflict, it needs to be a hybrid mechanism. In other words, with the international community represented through numerous models that exist and have been tried out in many different places.
Yeah. Okay, so you are quite pessimistic at the fact that this will hold water in terms of the justice and accountability. But the fact that the war has stopped temporarily, even for now, you think is a good step, I guess. So that leaves room for dialogue and negotiations and for things to actually go the right way, is what you're saying, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, I am pessimistic based on observations of the last couple of months since the agreement was signed, right? So my pessimism is based on that. I'm not necessarily pessimistic of the long-term future. That depends on what happens moving forward. And of course, every day that passes without vicious war being conducted, it improves the climate for working on peace, addressing underlying grievances, and moving forward.
Yeah.
Right? But I can't see any answer to this unless there is a mechanism, in whatever form you do it, in terms of justice and accountability, because it is on the basis of that you have political solutions found and the attendant reconciliation and whatever form Ethiopian society wishes for itself for the future. So it's like this pill has to be swallowed sooner or later. Ethiopia cannot be an exception, will not be an exception, as no other country has ever been an exception to this fundamental golden rule of history, and that is there is never any peace that is sustained without accountability for wrongs done also being factored into the process. This never happens elsewhere. It has never happened elsewhere. And I see no reason why Ethiopia will be immune to this iron rule of history.
Wow, yeah, that is a very strong statement. And I couldn't agree with you more, because like you mentioned, without justice and accountability, there will always be people who feel hard done by, no matter what political solutions that is presented to them. Without having that justice and accountability on an individual and also on a people level, on a region level, because that is what they are. We as Tigrayans have been saying, we have been targeted for our identity as a region. Therefore, the justice and accountability has to be able to address us as a region as well, as also as individuals too. So I completely agree with you on that statement, Mukesh. Moving on from that, in the piece, you mentioned the case of the Gambia and Myanmar, and you mentioned that there is jurisdiction for the International Court of Justice, for countries such as the Gambia to take Myanmar to court for crimes against humanity. And in the case of Tigray, crimes against humanity have been mentioned and have been entailed to what has happened in the region many times, by not just by Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, but also by the UN itself. It has mentioned that crimes against humanity has taken place. And it makes me wonder what the reason is why there is no other states, maybe within the African continent, maybe within the European continent, who is willing to pick this up and who is willing to actually take this to the courts. Is there political influence as to why this is not being done? And what is the difference between the case of the Gambia, Myanmar, and Tigray?
Well, it's still remarkable that little Gambia, thousands of miles away from Myanmar, had the courage to do this. And in a way, there was credibility for it because it had no personal stake in this. I mean, there is no connection between Gambia and Myanmar. And I don't know if anyone ever heard of the Rohingya in Gambia, right? So when this little West African nation decided to stand up for global humanity in this way, you couldn't argue that it was a political thing as far as Gambia was concerned. So now, unfortunately, here we are in the case of Ethiopia, a country, a very populous country, a very important country at the heart of Africa, and with a government that is very strong diplomatically and politically in pushing its agenda around the world, and particularly in Africa. I think it will require an extraordinarily courageous nation to use the same provision of international jurisdiction to bring a case against the perpetrators of these crimes in front of the International Court of Justice, which has the remit to consider such things. So yeah, I mean, if Tigrayans can find someone to sponsor them to do this, it would be fantastic. It would be done. Alternatively, it is open for victims in European jurisdictions like in Germany or France or Belgium, which have been pioneers in this particular area, to bring cases in European courts for the harm that's been done to them and their communities because of the mass atrocities committed against them. Now, that is also possible to be done. Either way, these legal redress mechanisms are very fragile. And one of the problems of international justice, as I also mentioned in my article, is that, yes, we have this grant, we have the International Criminal Court, we have the International Court of Justice, and we have got many other tribunals and stuff like that, you see. But for ordinary people, and for these highly politicized situations, you might as well have these arrangements on the moon. The chances of actually getting there are close to zero in reality. That's why, yes, these are mechanisms, and yes, they should be explored. And, maybe we can get Mrs. Clooney to get involved in this in the way that she's been helping the Darfuris in front of the International Criminal Court. And I'm sure there are creative lawyers around the place, the creative African lawyers. We have the African Court of Human Rights and People's Rights as well. So explore. But while that is all to be explored, we also have to talk about real justice for people on the ground. And it's a general principle of justice that the closer it is to the aggrieved people, to the victims, if you like, the more its impact in terms of signal you want to send. And the signal you want to send from justice is not, we're going to lock you up forever, or we are going to execute you or as a war criminals. That's not the point of justice. The point of justice is to send a signal that we acknowledge something wrong has happened. Those who have done that wrong have been recognized as having done it wrong, and society will extract a reasonable penalty to have a demonstration effect on others. Remember in Rwanda what happened? The Rwandans abolished the death penalty after the biggest genocide that took place in 1994. As President Kagame said, there's been enough killings in our country. The last thing we want to do is to go around executing people, you see. But justice happened. A combination of international tribunal plus actually a lot of domestic mechanisms whereby people could share their stories, and they could also decide community by community what they wanted to be doing about it. I thought it was an excellent example of a hybrid approach. That is what I would be recommending also for Ethiopia. But if the state gets in the way, and if the African Union, which is, as I was saying earlier, largely a club of states, if you like, it's not on the side of the people of Africa, it is on the side of the states of Africa. You have to understand that very clearly. Then I think this is not going to happen without a lot more agitation that will need to be done, and perhaps even changes in the governance of Ethiopia before that time comes.
Yeah, I mean, I think I couldn't agree with you more when you said the African Union is for the African states as states and not for the individuals. I think that in itself is a bit worrying, seeing as it's the African Union that brokered this deal with with the Ethiopian government and the TPLF. And clearly this will have a lot of effect on the people on the ground, yet it's the states that are priority for this organization that I think is slightly worrying to me. But, you know, when you mentioned Rwanda, I think one thing that Rwanda did very well is that they worked on the identity of Rwandans, of trying to reconfigure what Rwandans believed was their identity, because they believed that there was something fundamentally wrong with the way Rwandans identified as being Rwandan, what it meant to be Rwandan. And they worked really hard to ensure that all Rwandans felt a sense of equality, felt a sense of belonging. And that was a lot of work that had to be done on a grassroots level, which they did do. They did on local level as well, even when it came to justice and accountability. And it was also done, obviously, as you mentioned, on a hybrid international kind of model as well. They used that for justice and accountability mechanisms as well. But it was a collaboration of many different efforts in order to get where they are now. And when you look at the current state of Ethiopia, what is worrying is that although, yes, the peace agreement, for example, has been signed with the TPLF, but you see similar kind of situations elsewhere, which kind of signifies the fact that it's not there is nothing that the state, as the Ethiopian state as a state sees as being an issue of society, an issue of the Ethiopian identity being some of the major issues that causes these kind of wars and causes this genocide, the identification of how people identify being Ethiopian. For example, we see a lot of issues in the Oromia region currently, with a lot of death in the Amhara community, victims of a lot of killings, and also with Oromos being attacked in the Amhara region, the Wallo region. So these things coming to light show that there is clearly something wrong with the way we identify under that branch of Ethiopianism. And is the state really equipped to deal with it, as the Rwandan government was during the process of trying to reconstruct their society and trying to get justice and accountability? Does that have to go in parallel, rather than justice and accountability being separate and of the identification of being Rwandan or being Ethiopian in this case?
Well, I think, firstly, the comparison with Rwanda can only go so far. You know, Rwanda is a small country. You can go from top to bottom in one day, and it's got a few million people. Ethiopia is a vast country with over 100 million people. Rwanda's ethnic issues were a colonial construct during the different phases of colonialism it had. Ethiopia has never been improperly, comprehensively colonized. And it has a long history going back, centuries. So with a combination of all those, in terms of its different groups that were welded together into a nation that we now know as Ethiopia. So for geographical, historical, and all those other reasons, I think the situation is extremely different. But I think, the sense of national identity cannot be imposed simply by diktat. So, and it would be a mistake, for example, in Ethiopia, for the government to say, right, from tomorrow, all of you are Ethiopian, and no one is allowed to call yourself anything else. And anyone who says they are this, that, or the other, Tigrayan or Roma or whatever, then the law will go against them. You can't destroy ethnicity like that. I come from India originally, and you know how many groups there are in there. And people have no problems in being Indian, and they also belonging to particular communities. And of course, there are plenty of conflicts in India, as we know. Or in Britain, we have the English and the Scottish and the Welsh. So let us not make ethnicity the bogeyman on which to beat this particular, to try and make this the false problem behind which Ethiopia is doomed to conflict. I think it's the governance of Ethiopia that's more important rather than diversity of the ethnicity of Ethiopia. So there, Ethiopia should be proud of its many different ethnic groups. Oh my God, what a country! So many communities and so many richness of culture and so on and so forth. That's its greatest strength. It should make a virtue out of it. But how you actually then govern such a diverse nation is something that requires wisdom, which I'm afraid the current or recent generation of Ethiopian leaders have not had. Whether we're talking about the imperial leaders of the past or whether we're talking about the communist era or the post-Mengistu era, they have governed the country in such a disgraceful manner that you find your great country reduced to the state it is in. But this is not about ethnicity. It is about governance. And there you always have a choice on how you govern a multi-ethnic state, as opposed to try and wield everyone into some identicate Ethiopian, which you will never get, because Ethiopians are not like that. They're diverse. In the same way, you're never going to get everyone across the vastness of India just being Indian and just obliterate the differences between the different communities.
I think some of the different parties within the Tigray region, for example, mentioned a very good point that kind of supports somewhat of what you were saying. They think the Ethiopian process, the Ethiopian nation building process, was never finished. They say it had begun, but it was never completed. And the reason of that being uncompleted is why there are a lot of disputes between the different nationalities, nations, and peoples within the region, within the state. And the fact that there are nations, nationalities, and peoples, which is what Ethiopia as a state identifies the different categories of people living under its stated as. The fact that they all identified in a different manner, and their relationship with Ethiopia as an empire in itself during the imperial years was completely different, and their historical context also derived from somewhere completely different, where one's sense of pride was the other's root of oppression. So that in itself is something that will take a long time to even reconcile. But the question is, with the amount of wounds that we've got right now, do you believe it is reconcilable? Or do you believe that the best thing to do is actually allow Ethiopia to take its natural course into allowing the people living within it to be able to self-determine or kind of administer themselves, for the sake of peace, for the sake of cohesion, and for the sake of being able to be tolerant in living with each other?
I think my short answer is that self-determination is always a good thing. So, and what that means is that if the different communities of a country, and Ethiopia or anywhere else you like to see, like for example in the UK, Scotland is arguing about wanting to go off on its own, like it was an independent kingdom 300 years ago. And now, self-determination is a good thing, because when people voluntarily decide to stay together or split apart, this will definitely bring a more sustainable relationship. For example, it may well be that more autonomy in governing their affairs, and then a closer association on some things that people want to hold in common, and other things that want to run their own affairs in their own regions, is, I think, a very sensible way to actually govern a diverse nation. And there is nothing sacrosanct about national boundaries either, by the way. I mean, all through history, countries have been born and reformed and deformed all through time. I mean, you only have to look at the Soviet Union, and now you're looking at Western Europe. You see that now all the small countries of Western Europe are now trying to become the European Union. And even in Africa, there is a movement towards African countries coming together, despite retaining their different geographies and regions. So I think the Ethiopians should relax. They should relax. They should not worry about somehow the sacrosanctness about the national, Ethiopian territory. It's the people who are sovereign, not a piece of land, because a piece of land will break and form and reform all through history. And anyway, most of these boundaries are, at least in recent history, colonial boundaries. Now, speaking personally, I would be sorry if Ethiopia fragmented into kind of, I don't know, 10 or 20 different little states. I think I would be sorry about that. In the same way that I was sorry when Sudan fractured into Sudan and what we now know as South Sudan. I was the head of the UN at that time. And while I was totally opposed to the genocidal policies of President Bashir in Khartoum, and as you know, went totally against him. But nevertheless, it's a moment of sadness when people fall apart. But the best way to keep people together is not by forcing them into a shotgun marriage. I think in the long run, Ethiopia will be even more strong, even more influential, even be more at peace within itself, with its neighbors, and with the rest of the world, by allowing greater freedoms for its peoples. And through that, the idea of a nationhood will grow to the extent that people want it. And there is no kind of sacrosanct rules about it. So I think I don't understand why narrow sectarian nationalism why so many communities in Ethiopia are going down that route, and in the process they're damaging the whole state. So paradoxically, the solution, the problem with all this is that the state will break up if the different groups in Ethiopia go down the routes that they have been going down in recent decades. And you cannot impose this through this constitution or that constitution. So it's like the peace process, like the piece of paper. You can argue about constitutions and changing constitutions every 10 minutes for something different is not necessarily going to bring peace either. Peace making and living together is a process. And while self-identity is an important part of it, and it cannot be dictated away either by legislation or by some kind of dictatorship, if you like. It can be built upon. Diversity is a source of strength. We know that that historically speaking, that the more diverse a country, the more successful it is in practice in relation to its kind of place in the world. And I would like to think that Ethiopia will one day be a strong, diverse nation, but which respects all its citizens equally, without one group trying to dominate another group, or one government trying to dictate how the diverse peoples of Ethiopia should live. And I don't understand why people don't have the sense to see that.
Okay, so my only pushback on that point is that I think even from what I've picked up on some of the things that you said previously is that you can constitute the genocides sometimes to be the whole of a society, not just a couple of elites or a number of people, and then the rest are almost led, which actually, if that's the case, if you believe that, a society, or the whole of the society, is actually accountable for genocides, then how do you reconcile the way that Tigrayans should feel when the whole of society within the Ethiopian state committed this genocide on them? And again, like if we go back historically, this is the third time that this has happened to them as a society, as Tigrayans. So would you not think that if this is repeated throughout history and in the present day, where there are a lot of laws, international laws to prohibit such things, so like genocides and crimes against humanity, and that is still surpassed enough for the society to commit this genocide on them, is nationalism actually not a form of self-defense? Is nationalism not a sentimental or emotional kind of push because the Tigrayans feel different? But is it not a matter of security and a matter of survival?
Well, I think you're right on one point, and that is that when a genocide has been committed, then normal laws of civilization don't apply. That's why I have said in the past in my public pronouncements that if considering all the terrible things that have happened to the people of Tigray, including genocidal violence, they have every justification for wanting to be an independent state, because Ethiopia lost its legitimacy as a state when its agents, which is its governing structures, its institutions, and its army, committed genocidal violence against a component of its nation. So it's lost the legitimacy. So in that context, which is a specific genocidal context, the victims of a genocide have every right, a moral right, to go their own way. So absolutely, if Tigray wants to become an independent state, it has more of a case now than anyone else or any other part of Ethiopia, simply because of the genocidal violence that has been committed against the Tigrayan people. Now, there have been mass atrocities committed there have been atrocities committed in many parts of Ethiopia. People have been treated cruelly in other communities also, whether it's Oromo or Amhara or whoever you like, or Somalis or whatever. But there's a whole lot of difference between genocidal atrocities and just atrocities, in a way. So that right doesn't extend necessarily to other parts of Ethiopia. I'm here speaking only from the context of genocide. But as I say, it would be much better for Ethiopia, for all the people to live together, than for the country to break apart. But that is an idealistic approach. What the practical approach is, one that allows people to live in peace and security and ensure that this genocidal violence is not repeated. As an example, let's go back to Germany, that committed the terrible Holocaust. And what happened after the Nazi period was Germany had to go through a period of denazification under international engagement, supervision, and intervention. It was only when that happened, and the German people themselves responded in a kind of constructive manner, because, by the way, the Germans were also victims of the Nazis, that we led to what the Germany that you see now, in a way, and where they don't forget the past. The past is always there, and yet today's Germany is indescribably different from the Germany of the Nazis, right? And they remain as a nation together. So study those processes. And if you look at some other experiences around the world, we also see that. We see that some people, even when they've committed mass atrocities against each other, or one group has done a lot against a particular group, targeted group, they have found a way through that, but always not short-circuiting the process. That's why I said in my article, there are no shortcuts to this. I don't know whether Ethiopia will remain as a nation or deserves to remain as a nation, or what will happen to it, you see. But what I do know is that its destiny will be determined by what it does in relation to the injustices that have been committed, to components of its populations, and especially Tigrayans. And here, this is not to say that other groups are not suffering, or terrible things have not happened. We are not having that. We can have that debate, but that's not my point. My point is, we cannot demean the word genocide by simply applying that term to any mass atrocity that happens and say, "Oh, that's genocide." Because if we do that, then I think we do those who actually suffered genocide, whether it was Jews in the Holocaust, or whether it was the Tutsi in Rwanda, or whether it was those people in Cambodia, or what I was heavily involved in, the African origin Darfuris in Sudan, we would be doing them a grave disservice. So labels are important. And based on those labels, I think the path is also clear. And because there have been acts of genocide committed in Tigray, and that's not just me saying or you saying, this is actually said by many people, and let others decide, that special mechanisms of justice and accountability and healing and pulling yourself up and pulling together will need to be required. You can't go back to business as usual. Even if the same atrocities were committed in another country, but they were not genocidal, the process would be different. Genocide in Tigray puts it onto a completely different level of process. I'm afraid that is not recognized in the current peace process, the current peace agreement, and that is not acknowledged in any transitional justice talk that I have seen. And as long as you hide this reality, as long as people hide this reality under the table because they don't want to say it because of the political implications and all the rest of it, then I'm afraid Ethiopia will carry on blundering its way through periodic cycles of war and peace.
ጥንኩር ማሕበራውን ፖለቲካውን ቅጥዋውን ከምኡውን ድልዱል ስነልቦናዊ ሓድነት ተጋሩ ዝወነነት ምዕብልትን ዲሞክራሲያዊትን ትግራይ ኣብ ምግሃድ ናይ ባዕላ እጃም እትፃወት ዘላ መራኸቢ ሓፋሽ ስርቂ ሓሶት ምድንጋር ግዕዚና ዓመፅን ዓፈናን ኣብ ምፍሻልን ዝፅዮፎም ትውልዲ ኣብ መፍጣር ኣትሪራ ትሰርሕ ኣኽሱማውያን መራኸቢ ሓፋሽ ጽባሕ ምጅማር ለበዳ ኮሮና ቫይረስ ጀሚራ እዞም ስዕቡ ሽቶታትን ዕላማን ተሓንጊጣ ካብቲ ምስረት ልዕሊ 2 ዓመት ኣቁፂራ ኣላ ኣኽሱማውያን መራኸቢ ሓፋሽ ብፍላይ ድማ ኣብ ልዕሊ ህዝቢ ትግራይ ዘርኢ ምጽናት ድሕሪ ምእዋጁ ለይትን ቀትርን ድምፂ ህዝቢ ብምዃን ብሳላ ደገፍታን ኣባላታን ክሳብ ሎሚ እናሰርሐት ጸኒሓ ኣላ ሎሚ ድማ ብምኽንያት በዓል መበል ካልኣይ ዓመት ምስረታ እንታይ ንግበር ብዝብል ቴማ ናይ ዘተ መድረኽ ኣዳልያ ኣብ መላእ ዓለም ዘለኹም ተጋሩ ንዑ ንዛተ ትብለኩም ኣላ ለካቲት 11/2023 ሰዓት 1 ጀሚሩ ክሳብ 4 ሰዓት ኢስተርን ታይም ኣብ መላእ ዓለም ዘለኹም ተጋሩን ፈተውቲ ተጋሩን ተዓዲምኩም ኣለኹም ዕዱማት ኣጋይሽና ተጋዳላይ ኣማንኤል መረሳ መንእሰይ ሜላት ሃብቱ ዶክተር ማዕርግ ኣድሓኖም ዶክተር ሰሎሞን መዝገቦ ንዑ ንዛተ ንገማገም ندقاقف نتحدث يولون علو كيترسعو لكاتيت 11/2023 كاب ساعة 1 جميرو كساب 4 ساعات أخسماوين مرخب حفاش.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. Absolutely. I think there has been a sense of trying to create equivalence for all atrocities committed in the Ethiopian state, and then by default putting the Tigray genocide into the mix of those things and taking away the significance and the severity of what a genocide actually is. And I think, again, I think what such an accurate statement of saying it does a disservice to people who have been inflicted with genocide, for those who have faced genocide. So I think the very last question, which kind of summarizes some of the things that you just said, you mentioned that a genocide has never been ended with a peace deal. And that statement, I think, was one of the biggest, awakening kind of statements for me, because a lot of Tigrayans had a lot of hope in peace and some type of negotiation leading to the end of the genocide. But if we do believe that this is an actual genocide and not just a war, how do we go about seeking the end to the genocide if it's not through the peace deal?
Well, I think yes, I wish history was different. But if you look into all the genocides recognized or almost recognized in history, right, in every continent, in every epoch in time, since the word was invented, or even since before the word was invented, but the phenomenon was occurring, you will see that genocides have only ended when the genociders have been defeated militarily. Now, I mean, that's what history teaches us. But, thing is, possibly we can make new history. So I'm not saying that there are certain iron laws of history, which I mentioned, the peace and the justice and accountability side, for example. But today's wars are very different from yesterday's wars. So when we say the genocides have only ended through the use of force, you only have to look at Rwanda, Cambodia, and obviously the Nazi Holocaust. It required the coming in of force. Now, but because today's wars are very different kinds of wars to the old style wars, it is possible that today's genocide could be ended through warring in a different way against the genocidaires. And this is where the appropriate peace processes, including justice and accountability, come into it. And an important part of that is you got to say the word. You got to acknowledge what has happened, and you got to actually have the mechanism for the truths to come out and be said. It is not about, as I say, it is not about crime and punishment. It's about crime and accountability. And accountability comes in many different forms. Punishment is just one of the ways to have accountability. See? So, my counsel in all of this would be to continue to fight. I don't use the word fight in the warring sense of guns. I mean to struggle, to continue to struggle for justice and accountability. And by doing that, peace in its different forms will come. And it will not necessarily be something that will happen on the 1st of June or the 1st of October or the 1st of January or whatever. It will be an organic process. It will grow. It will happen by itself. And that's why my article also talks about remembering, because if you look back at some phenomena in history where the actual justice and accountability only comes even when generations have passed, when people say, yep, what our forefathers did, whether it's slavery or colonialism or whatever, is wrong. And then you build memorials, you build museums, you send school children, to do lessons on this on this topic, and then slowly, society acknowledges what we did in the 18th century or what we did, 50 years ago somewhere was terrible. How could we do this? In the old days, women were burnt at the stake as witches, and today you would say, "Oh my God!" So think about justice and accountability in those terms as well. In the end, it is the recognition of wrongs in the hearts and minds of people and generations current and along the way. That is the best form of accountability and justice that can happen. That doesn't mean, by the way, impunity for those who did the rapes on which happened on an industrial scale in Tigray. That doesn't mean all the murderers and killers and rapists can go away scot-free. I'm not talking about that, you see. But the specific forms of justice for the individual wrongdoers, and particularly those who commanded and controlled them, that's the important people there. should be seen in the context of the bigger justice and accountability. If you don't do that, then there's a kind of narrow justice and accountability. Just that bunch of Eritrean soldiers, committed so many rapes in that village. Those bunch of paramilitary Ethiopian paramilitary did this, that, or the other. Important as that is, of acknowledging that, see, that would be what I would call reductionist justice. And when you have massive crimes against humanity, you need expansive justice, not reductionist justice. You get my point? That maybe I'm not clear, but
no, absolutely. No, absolutely. I do understand what you're saying. Thank you. I think that was very comprehensive. It's a difficult question to answer as that as well. So thank you. I think that was very digestible. Thank you so much for your time, Mukesh. I think we're rounding up now. That was my last question. Thank you so much for taking out some of your very important time from a lot of the things that you're involved with, a lot of the things that you do. You're a professor, so you have a lot of responsibilities, and thank you for taking out some of that time and giving it to us, giving it to this discussion, which has been very insightful. And as always, every time that we have a conversation with you, we learn a lot. And I think it's very eye-opening as well for a lot of the Tigrayans who are currently confused after this peace deal of how they need to maneuver moving forward, what this means for their part in seeking justice and accountability, and whether this peace deal gives them that.
My final word on that, to all the Tigrayans and all the Ethiopians and all Africans and all human beings all over the world, keep struggling for fairness, keep struggling for justice and accountability, whatever wrongs you have experienced or you are in touch with or aware of, but work for the bigger justice and accountability, not just for yourself. Take the bigger picture, rise above your hurts and wrongs, and struggle for the bigger good. That is not to deny all the terrible things that have happened to you, but to have meaning, to give it meaning. Your struggle has to be the struggle of everyone. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that was helpful. Keep struggling is a very prominent message, very significant. I think keep struggling for not just yourself, but something greater than yourself. So thank you so much, Mukesh. I really do appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us here on Axumawian Media and Inside Tigray.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching Inside Tigray. We will be back next time with more topics and more guests.